There was a time in America when walking into church barehanded felt as shocking as walking in barefoot. A pair of white cotton gloves, pressed flat, laid beside a hymnal on a polished pew. That was the price of admission. Not money. Fabric. The right fabric, in the right color, at the right length, on the right day. An entire invisible rule book governed Sunday morning, and nobody remembered writing it, but everybody knew when you broke it. The Sunday outfit was not an outfit. It was armor. Every piece had a job. Start at the top. The hat. Emily Post's 1950 edition made it plain. A lady never left the house without gloves and a hat, for any occasion more formal than a neighborhood errand. A neighborhood errand, by the way, meant walking to a mailbox. Everything else required architecture on your head. Not too much architecture, though. Amy Vanderbilt's 1952 guide specified that your brim could not exceed a width that blocked the view of the person sitting behind you in church. Freedom of expression, as long as your expression didn't inconvenience Mrs. Henderson in pew 6. The hat stayed on indoors. Women kept hats on in church, unlike men, which created the peculiar optics of a congregation where one half looked ready for a garden party and the other half looked like they'd just come in from the rain. Securing the hat required hatpins, some up to 10 inches long. Several American cities had actually banned excessively long hatpins back in the 1910s, on the grounds that they were essentially concealed weapons. By the 50s, those ordinances were mostly forgotten, but etiquette columns still referenced them, just in case you were thinking of going full jousting lance on a Sunday morning. Below the hat, gloves. White cotton for daytime church services in warm weather, kid leather for cooler months or more formal occasions. The average American woman in 1955 owned 3 to 5 pairs of dress gloves in varying lengths. Wrist length for church, mid-arm for afternoon events, opera length for evenings out, meaning up past your elbow, as if you might perform surgery but elegantly. Founds Brothers and Company, established 1777, and Hanson Glove Corporation dominated the market. Both supplied department stores nationwide. Both sourced from a single town. Gloversville, New York. Population roughly 30,000. Industry? Gloves. That's it. 90% of all American dress gloves passed through Gloversville in the early 1960s. 10,000 workers, 3 generations of families stitching fingers into kid leather and white cotton. A girl named Shirley Kobuski started sewing glove fingers there at 16 in 1956, joining her mother and grandmother on the factory floor. Her family's livelihood depended entirely on other women's Sunday ritual. Every pair of gloves on every pew in every church in America had a Shirley behind it. By 1964, her factory closed. She retrained as a nurse, but that comes later. The Sears Roebuck 1955 Spring and Summer Catalog devoted 14 pages to women's hats and 8 pages to gloves. 22 pages of accessories for a single morning per week. That catalog understood priorities. Below the gloves, the good coat. Every family had one. Not a coat, the coat. A single high-quality overcoat reserved exclusively for church, funerals, and formal visits. Families routinely spent 15 to 20% of their annual clothing budget on it. In 1955 terms, a family earning $4,000 a year would spend $80 to $120 on a coat worn 52 days a year. 2 to 3 weeks' pay for a garment that spent 6 days a week in a closet. And nobody blinked. The good coat was a budgeting staple, like rent or groceries. It just happened to live on a hanger. Below the coat, the dress, but we'll skip that because the real drama lived lower. Seamed stockings, fully fashioned nylon, manufactured on flat knitting frames, with a visible seam running up the back of the leg. The seam was proof the stocking was real nylon, not rayon, a quality marker. Also, a public examination. Before leaving the house, women asked friends or husbands to check that the back seam was straight. This was an intimate, tender, slightly anxious moment. A crooked seam in church was a verdict, not on your legs, on your discipline, on whether you had someone at home who cared enough to look. At their peak in 1953, American women purchased 1.6 billion pairs of nylon stockings per year, required even in July, required even when the thermometer suggested that wrapping your legs in synthetic fiber was an act of self-punishment, which, in a sense, it was. And beneath all of it, invisible but load-bearing, the girdle. Maidenform and Playtex ran advertisements in Ladies' Home Journal through the 50s, explicitly tying foundation garments to Sunday dress propriety. The implication was clear. You could not go to church unsupported. Structurally or spiritually. The rules didn't stop at what you wore, though. They dictated what you did with every piece once you sat down. Gloves on when entering church, gloves off to receive communion, gloves on again after. Never shake hands while gloved, but enter gloved. The sequence was door, gloves on, pew, sit, hymnal, gloves off for communion, gloves on, exit, greeting line, gloves off for handshake, gloves on for the walk home. This is not a parody. This was Tuesday's lesson in deportment class. The enforcement mechanism was not written anywhere. It was other women. The church door functioned as a gauntlet. You walked through it, and 40 pairs of eyes conducted a silent audit. Hat, present. Gloves, white, clean, correct length. Seams, straight. Coat, appropriate weight for the season. Handbag, matching. Shoes, closed toe. Any deviation registered instantly and was discussed over coffee cake within the hour. Regional variations existed, but only within narrow bands. The South was stricter. A bare head in a Southern Baptist church in 1954 would have generated the kind of silence usually reserved for someone dropping a hymnal during prayer. The Midwest was marginally more practical. Gloves could be slightly off-white if you lived on a farm and the roads were dirt. This was considered progressive. In black churches, the hat carried weight far beyond etiquette. For black women, the Sunday hat was not mere fashion compliance. It was a weekly act of dignified self-presentation against a world that denied their dignity 6 days a week. The elaborate crowns, as they were called, were spiritual armor. They persisted long after white mainstream hat culture collapsed because they were never just about rules. They were about reclamation. And if adults navigated this obstacle course with the grim competence of experience, imagine being 7 years old. White gloves for girls from age 4, sold in packs of 2 pairs at J.C. Penney and Woolworths, because 1 pair was always in the wash. The marketing was explicit. You needed backup gloves because children are children, and cotton is white, and the 2 facts exist in permanent opposition. Boys got clip-on ties and shoes polished to a mirror finish by fathers who treated the ritual like a military inspection, which, functionally, it was. The pre-church inspection happened at the front door. Mothers checked glove whiteness. A smudge meant going back inside, washing hands again, finding the backup pair. Hair was checked, collars straightened, posture corrected. Easter Sunday was the Super Bowl of this particular sport. New outfits were mandatory. Catalogs timed their spring lines to Easter because every child in America was going to stand in front of a congregation and be visually evaluated by 200 adults who had known their family for 3 generations. The psychological imprint was permanent. Many boomers, 70 years later, still feel a physical twinge dressing too casually for church. The glove inspection lives in their nervous system. It never fully left. So what shattered a code that had survived 2 world wars, the Depression, and the arrival of television? Everything hit at once. 1960. John F. Kennedy attends his inauguration without a top hat for most of the ceremony. He carried one, he occasionally put it on, but the photographs showed him bareheaded, young, modern. The popular version of history credits Kennedy with killing the men's hat. The accurate version is more boring. Hat sales were already declining because of car culture. You can't wear a fedora in a car with a low roofline. Myths don't care about accuracy, though, and Kennedy's bare head gave every man in America permission to leave his hat on the shelf. 1961. Jackie Kennedy wears a pillbox hat designed by Halston for Bergdorf Goodman. The last great hat moment. The final flourish before the collapse. Paradoxically, it was so iconic that it froze the hat in amber. After Jackie, you were either wearing a pillbox or you were wearing nothing. Most women chose nothing. 1962 to 65, Vatican II. The Second Vatican Council quietly drops the requirement for women to cover their heads in Catholic churches. Canon 1262 of the 1917 Code had mandated it for centuries. Gone. Just like that. Millions of Catholic women took off their chapel veils and mantillas, and the gesture radiated outward. If the Pope didn't require it, why would the Methodists? 1965 to 68. Pantyhose arrive and annihilate the seamed stocking. No more seam-checking ritual, no more garter belt engineering. The entire intimate architecture of getting dressed on Sunday morning simplified into pulling on a single garment. The youth counterculture rejected formality wholesale. Teased hairstyles didn't fit under hats. Department stores began shrinking their millinery sections. By 1968, U.S. hat sales had dropped 50% from their 1955 peak. The Millinery Institute of America, the trade organization that had promoted hat wearing for decades, had already shuttered in 1960. It didn't even survive to see the worst of it. Lily Dachet, the queen of hats, a French-born milliner who, at her peak, employed 150 workers and sold 9,000 hats a year from her East 56th Street salon in New York, closed her business. She told Women's Wear Daily, "Women have stopped wearing hats, and I have nothing left to say." In Gloversville, factories went dark one by one. 46 million pairs of dress gloves produced in 1950, 12 million by 1970. The buildings still stand. Some are empty. Some are antique malls. The town that dressed America's hands on Sunday morning became a monument to a ritual that evaporated. Many women remember a specific Sunday. The first time they walked into church without a hat. The mixture of liberation and guilt. Wind on hair that had always been covered in that space. Some describe it as exhilarating. Some describe it as almost sacrilegious. Most land on both. The code survives in fragments. Black church hat traditions continue with joy and purpose. British royal events still enforce fascinators. Occasionally, a TikTok trend rediscovers Sunday best aesthetics, and a generation that never owned a pair of white gloves tries them on for content. And somewhere in a drawer, tissue-wrapped, never thrown away, a grandmother's white cotton gloves sit in the dark. They don't fit anyone anymore. Nobody irons them, nobody checks them for smudges at the front door, but nobody throws them out either. They were never just fabric. They were the last generation's way of saying, this hour matters more than the rest of the week. Maybe that's the part worth keeping, long after the gloves themselves have gone.